The rain came down in silver sheets, slicing through the dark as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away what had been done that night. In the cold glow of the command post screens, the message blinked over and over, awaiting confirmation. Execute prisoners. Lieutenant Mara Vale sat frozen before the console, her trembling fingers hovering over the confirmation key. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale, exhausted, but still unmistakably human. Outside, the muffled thunder of distant gunfire rolled through the valley like a dying heartbeat. It had been a long, bloody war. They said it would be quick, a few weeks of fighting to restore order. That was 10 months ago. 10 months since she'd last seen the sky without drones circling it. 10 months since orders had stopped sounding like orders and started sounding like excuses. She was 27, but the mirror told a different story. Her eyes, once warm and bright, looked older now, carved by things she couldn't unsee. When the order came through, she thought it was a mistake. The prisoners were civilians, farmers, miners, people caught in the wrong place. But command had labeled them insurgents. The directive was clear: no witnesses. Ma read the line twice, then a third time. Her heart pounded so loud it drowned out the rain. She could hear the low hum of the power generators, the tapping of raindrops against the tent's canvas, and somewhere outside, the soft crying of the medic who'd been patching up wounded all day. The war had turned good people into ghosts long before they died. Her hand moved to the comm unit. "Command, this is Lieutenant Vale," she said, voice cracking just enough to betray the storm inside. "Requesting confirmation on the last directive." Static hissed, then a clipped voice answered. "Confirmed, Lieutenant. Execute immediately. No exceptions." "That's an order." She swallowed hard. "Sir, these are—" "Execute," the voice repeated, colder now. "Or I'll find someone who will." The line went dead. For a long moment, Mara just sat there, staring at the console. The rain drummed harder, like the sky was keeping time with her heartbeat. She looked over at Sergeant Ivers, her second in command, a man who'd been in the service longer than she'd been alive. His face was stone. "You heard him," Ivers said. "We follow orders." She looked past him, through the tent flap, where the prisoners huddled under makeshift tarps, wet, shivering, terrified. One of them was a girl, maybe 16. She had dirt on her face and eyes that still believed someone might save her. Mara felt her stomach twist. "They're not enemy combatants," she whispered. Ivers' jaw tightened. "We don't get to decide that, Lieutenant." But something inside her broke then. Something small but strong. Maybe it was the last spark of her conscience. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I can't do it." Ivers turned sharply. "What did you say?" She met his eyes. "I won't fire on unarmed prisoners." The silence that followed was heavier than the thunder outside. Ivers stared at her for what felt like an eternity, then slowly shook his head. "You just signed your own discharge papers," he muttered. "If you're lucky." He walked out into the rain. She didn't follow. Hours later, the prisoners were gone, quietly released, under cover of night. Mara logged the mission as completed and filed a fabricated after-action report. She told no one. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. 2 days later, Command requested her mission log. She hesitated before sending it, her hands trembling as she watched the data upload. She knew what would happen. They'd find the gaps, the inconsistencies, the missing records. And then they'd come for her. But she couldn't bring herself to care. 3 weeks passed before the official summons arrived. "Report to Central Command immediately." The journey there felt like walking into her own execution. The base was quiet when she arrived. Too quiet. The guards didn't speak as they escorted her down the long gray corridor to the commander's office. Inside, Commander Jonas Wren sat behind his desk, the room dim except for the bluish glow of his monitor. He was a mountain of a man, his uniform crisp, his face carved by decades of war. He didn't look up when she entered. "Lieutenant Vale," he said finally, his voice even. "Sit." She did. Her throat felt dry. He tapped a key, and her mission log appeared on the screen. Lines of text scrolled by. Tactical details, coordinates, transmission records. Everything looked normal until the end, where the execution report should have been. Instead, there was a blank line and a single note, non-compliance due to ethical violation. Reed leaned back in his chair, his eyes unreadable. "You refused to follow a direct order," he said. "You falsified a mission report. You released enemy captives. Do you deny any of that?" "No, sir." The words hung in the air like the final toll of a bell. He was silent for a long time, studying her face. The sound of rain against the windows filled the room again, relentless and steady. "Why?" he asked at last. Mara looked down at her hands. They were shaking, because it was wrong. Wren didn't respond. He simply turned the monitor toward himself and began to read through the rest of her log, the details she hadn't expected him to notice. He saw the notes about her squad's exhaustion, her reports of civilian casualties, the small observations she'd made about the cost of each mission. She had written, "We are losing more than lives. We are losing ourselves." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he closed the file and stared at the wall behind her. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost human. "Do you know how many soldiers I've seen follow orders without question? Hundreds, maybe thousands. And do you know how many of them I've respected?" Mara looked up slowly. "How many, sir?" "One," he sighed. "Maybe two now." The words caught her off guard. He stood, walked to the window and looked out at the storm. "You know what happens next," he said. "Refusing an order in wartime is mutiny. Normally it's a court-martial, sometimes worse." She nodded. "I understand." He turned back to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told another story. They were tired eyes, haunted eyes. "I once had a lieutenant like you," he said quietly. "She disobeyed orders too, saved a village from being bombed. They branded her a traitor. I signed the papers myself." He looked down, jaw tight. "She didn't survive the trial." Mara didn't know what to say. Wren sat back at his desk and exhaled slowly, the sound rough and weary. "You remind me of her. That's why this is difficult." He opened a new file on his monitor and began typing. Mara couldn't see what he was writing, but every keystroke felt like a countdown. When he stopped, he looked up. "You'll be reassigned," he said finally. "Remote Logistics Division, off the front lines." Mara blinked. "Sir, you're not filing charges?" "No," he interrupted. "But this conversation never happened. Your record stays clean. You understand?" She nodded, unable to speak. He nodded once, slowly, dismissed. Mara rose to her feet, saluted, and turned to leave. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. As she reached for the door, she heard a sound behind her, soft, almost inaudible. The commander was crying, and not the quiet kind of crying that comes from weakness, but the kind that comes from remembering too much. Mara froze at the door. She didn't turn around. The sound of the commander's quiet, ragged breathing filled the silence between thunderclaps. He didn't try to hide it. Maybe he didn't care anymore. "Go," he said finally, his voice breaking in a way she'd never heard from a superior before. "Before I change my mind." She stepped out into the corridor, her boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. The hallway felt longer this time, colder. When she reached the outside doors, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. but the air still carried that metallic scent of storm and smoke. She walked until the base was just a blur behind her, until the weight of what she'd done and what she hadn't done finally hit her. For the first time in months, she cried. Not out of fear or guilt or even relief, but because, for once, she'd chosen something that still made her feel human. Days turned into weeks. The war dragged on. Her reassignment took her far from the front. A communications post buried in the desert, where the only battles were fought with keyboards and static-filled transmissions. She spent her days monitoring supply routes and her nights staring at the stars, wondering if the prisoners she'd spared had made it home. Sometimes, when the wind howled outside her bunker, she imagined their faces. The young girl, the old man clutching his son's arm, the medic whispering prayers into the dark. They were the ghosts she could live with. But the war had a way of finding people, no matter how far they ran. 3 months later, a message arrived. It was encrypted and unsigned. Just coordinates and a brief note. They remember what you did. Come if you can. She hesitated. Leaving her post without orders meant desertion. But something inside her told her she had to go. She left that night, slipping away under the cover of a sandstorm. The desert wind erasing her footprints behind her. The coordinates led her to the ruins of a burned-out village on the edge of the valley, a place she recognized instantly. It was the same outpost where she'd refused the order. Only now, it was silent. The tents were gone, the vehicles rusted, the world eerily still, and yet someone was waiting. A small fire flickered in the distance. As she approached, a figure stood to meet her, cloaked, thin, familiar. It was the girl, the same one she'd refused to shoot. Mara stopped dead, her breath catching. "You," she whispered. The girl nodded slowly. She looked older now, harder, but her eyes were still the same, alive. "I heard they moved you," the girl said. "I didn't think you'd come." Mara swallowed. "I almost didn't." The girl motioned for her to sit by the fire. Around them, a few others emerged from the shadows, the rest of the prisoners she'd freed. They were alive. Some bore scars, others limped, but they were there. One man stepped forward. "We've been trying to find you," he said. "To thank you." Mara shook her head. "You don't have to." "We do," the man interrupted gently. "Because you did what no one else would. You saw us as people." She felt the sting of tears again. "I broke orders. I lied. I don't even know what I am anymore." The girl smiled faintly. "Human. That's what you are." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fire crackle. Mara wanted to ask them what came next, where they'd go, what they'd do. But before she could, the distant hum of engines echoed across the valley. "Headlights!" Her stomach dropped. "Get down!" she hissed. The group scattered as armored transports crested the hill. Soldiers poured out, weapons raised. Mara's instincts kicked in. She grabbed the girl and pulled her behind a collapsed wall. Through the chaos, she heard a voice bark an order. Sharp, familiar. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" She peeked out and froze. It was Commander Wren. He stood in the floodlights, his uniform soaked with sweat and dust. His men lowered their rifles slowly, uncertain. Mara rose, hands trembling. "Sir?" He stared at her across the distance, eyes hard but glimmering with something else. Relief, maybe. "You're a damn fool, Lieutenant," he said. "You should have stayed where I sent you." She didn't answer. The prisoners behind her tensed, expecting the worst. Rand walked forward until he stood just a few feet away. "You disobeyed orders again," he said quietly. "That's twice now." Mara met his gaze. "If you're here to arrest me, do it. But leave them alone." He looked past her, at the faces of the people she'd saved, now staring back at him. He saw their scars, their trembling hands, their fear. And something in his expression shifted. He took a long breath, then lowered his weapon. "There's no one left to report to," he said. "Command collapsed 2 weeks ago. The war's ending." Mara blinked. "What?" Rand nodded. "Peace talks. Ceasefire's in effect as of midnight. It's over." For a moment, no one spoke. The wind carried the faint crackle of the fire, the rustle of dust through broken metal. Then the girl stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then why are you here?" Ren hesitated. "Because I had to see for myself, to know if you were still alive." Mara stared at him, trying to understand. "Why me?" He looked away. "When I read your log, I saw more truth in those few pages than in all the reports I've signed in 20 years. You reminded me of what we were supposed to be fighting for. Not flags, not lines on a map. People." His voice cracked slightly. "I wept that night, Lieutenant. I wept because I realized I'd stopped seeing them as people a long time ago." The silence that followed was heavy and real. Finally, Mara said softly, "What happens now?" Ren glanced toward the horizon where dawn was beginning to paint the clouds gold. "Now," he smiled faintly, "now we try to remember who we were before all this." He turned back to his men. "Stand down, we're done here." The soldiers hesitated, then obeyed. Weapons lowered. Engines cut. For the first time in a year, the valley was quiet. Mara watched as the commander walked past her, stopping only once to murmur, "You did the right thing, Vale. Never doubt that." Then he was gone, his convoy disappearing into the rising light. The prisoners gathered around her, their faces reflecting the first fragile hints of hope. Someone began to laugh, not mockingly but freely, like a weight had finally lifted. Mara smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. For once, the world didn't feel like it was burning. Weeks later, after the war officially ended, Mara received a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was her reassignment notice, "Honorable Discharge, Lieutenant Mara Vale." Beneath it, a handwritten note, "History forgets the ones who follow orders. It remembers the ones who keep their humanity." She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she walked outside, where the sun was rising again, bright and golden over a world learning how to breathe. For the first time in a long time, she didn't look back. And though the war had taken much, friends, innocence, years she could never reclaim, it hadn't taken everything. Somewhere, buried deep beneath the scars, her heart still beat steady. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones fought with guns or commands, but with conscience. And sometimes, doing what's right doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you human.